They say the heart of any company isn't in the C-suite, with its leather chairs and panoramic views. It's not in the sales bullpen, with its desperate energy and whiteboards full of acronyms. The real heart is in the server room. It's a cold, sterile space, smelling faintly of ozone and recycled air, and it has a pulse. It's the steady, 60-cycle hum of the machines that keep the whole fragile ecosystem alive. For 28 years, I was the head cardiologist of that heart. My name is Howard, and I was the IT help desk manager at Aerospec Logistics. To the executives, I was the guy who reset their passwords when they got locked out of their email for the third time in a week. To me, they were open books. I knew everything. I knew that the head of sales, a man who drove a Porsche, had a secret gambling addiction because I had to run data recovery on his accidentally wiped laptop, which was full of offshore betting site receipts. I knew that the marketing and product development departments were in a state of undeclared civil war because my team and I were the ones fielding tickets about unauthorized access to shared drives and mysteriously corrupted project files. We were the digital battlefield medics, patching up the wounds inflicted by ego and incompetence. We saw the digital fingerprints left behind by every secret, every lie, every shortcut, and we kept quiet. That was the job. We were the silent gears in a machine that thought it ran on vision and strategy, when in reality it ran on Cat6 cables and the patience of my team. If you've ever felt invisible at work, if you've ever been the one who keeps things running while others take the credit, then you know what I'm talking about. Stick around, because this story is for you. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a boss who couldn't find the power button, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the quiet ones who finally get their due. The day it all ended started like any other Tuesday. I was in my office, a glorified closet with no windows, mapping out the final phase of a security patch deployment. My coffee was cold, just the way I liked it. My focus was absolute. That's when the email came. Subject, urgent meeting. Sender, Gregory Finch, VP of Operations. Gregory was new, he was one of them. An MBA from a school I couldn't pronounce, hair that looked permanently wet, and a vocabulary composed entirely of buzzwords he'd learned in a seminar. He'd been with Aerospec for 6 months, and in that time had successfully streamlined the coffee budget and optimized the number of pens we were allowed to order. His presence was a constant low-grade hum of uselessness. I walked into the conference room. It was one of the big ones, the ones they used for scaring investors. The table was a vast expanse of polished mahogany, and at the far end sat Gregory Finch and a woman from HR I'd never seen before. Her smile was a perfect vacant curve. It was the kind of smile that precedes a firing. Gregory didn't ask me to sit. He just started talking, his voice dripping with the false empathy of a man who has practiced his lines in the mirror. He said things like paradigm shift and right sizing and evaluating core competencies. It was a corporate eulogy, and I was the corpse. He explained, with the clinical detachment of a surgeon describing a tumor he was about to remove, that the company was moving in a new direction. A more agile direction, a more cost-effective direction. He announced they were outsourcing the entire IT department to an offshore firm called Synthecorp. My entire team, David, who I'd hired straight out of community college 10 years ago and who could rebuild a server rack blindfolded, Maria, a single mom, who was the best cybersecurity analyst I'd ever worked with, all of them, gone, replaced by a line item on a spreadsheet. Then came the final, exquisite insult. Gregory leaned forward, placing his manicured hands on the table. He said, "Howard, your loyalty to this company is legendary. That's why we need you to stay on for the next 30 days. We need you to ensure a smooth transition. Document everything. Hand over all the keys. We're counting on you to be a team player, right to the end. A smooth transition." He wanted me to personally build the gallows, test the trapdoor, and then hand the executioner the rope. The HR woman slid a folder across the table. It was my severance package. A pathetic sum, a fraction of what I should have received, carefully calculated to be just enough to discourage a lawsuit. There was a non-compete clause in there so restrictive, It basically forbade me from touching a keyboard in the entire state for 2 years. He was not just firing me, he was trying to erase me from the industry I had helped build. I looked at Gregory, at his smug, confident face, the face of a man who had never had to troubleshoot a downed Exchange server at 3 a.m. on Christmas morning. The face of a man who believed competence was a commodity you could buy in bulk from the lowest bidder. And in that moment, something inside me, something that had been dormant for 28 years of quiet, dutiful service, woke up. I picked up the folder. I didn't open it. I just looked him straight in the eye and said, with a calm that seemed to unnerve him, "I understand. You can count on me." He smiled, relieved. The fool. He thought I meant I would cooperate. He didn't understand. I wasn't a saboteur. I was a systems architect, and I was simply going to follow my instructions with strategic surgical precision. I was going to give him the smoothest transition he could ever imagine. A transition so smooth, it would slide the entire company right off a cliff. The drive home was a blur. I remember the weight of my hands on the steering wheel, the familiar texture of the worn leather. I'd made this drive over 10,000 times, a 45-minute journey that bookended my days, my weeks, my entire adult life. It was a ritual so ingrained it required no conscious thought, which was a blessing, because my mind was a high-speed collision of shock, fury, and a cold, creeping dread. The freeway traffic, the billboards, the suburban sprawl, it all seemed like a movie playing on a screen just beyond my reach. My reality had shrunk to the confines of the car, to the sound of my own breathing, and to the words echoing in my head. Smooth transition, team player, legendary loyalty. They were just words, corporate jargon, but they felt like stones thrown at me, each one a small, sharp impact against the edifice of my career. Legendary loyalty, was that what it was, or was it legendary foolishness? For 28 years I had treated Aerospec like it was my own. I didn't just manage the systems, I bled for them. I had missed anniversaries to oversee network upgrades. I had canceled vacations because a critical server failed. I had poured my life into the digital arteries of that company, and in return they had given me a 30-day death sentence and a severance package that was a slap in the face. I pulled into my driveway and just sat there for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. The house was quiet. My wife, Sarah, was at her nursing job. The kids were grown and gone. It was just me and the silence was deafening. I walked through the front door, the smell of home, a strange comfort that felt unearned. I bypassed the kitchen, the living room, and went straight down to the basement, my workshop. It was my sanctuary, the one place in the world where everything made sense. It smelled of machine oil, old wood and brass. On my workbench, under the bright glare of a task lamp, sat my current project, a 1920s grandfather clock. Its intricate movement, a delicate universe of gears, springs, and escapements, was laid out on a piece of clean velvet. For me, restoring these old clocks was more than a hobby. It was an exercise in order and logic. Every piece had a purpose. Every gear had to mesh perfectly with the next. If you understood the system, you could diagnose the problem, you could fix it, you could make it whole again. I looked at the beautiful, complicated mess of brass and steel, and for the first time, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no peace. I just felt like one of those gears, a part that had been deemed obsolete, pulled from the mechanism and tossed aside. The mainspring of my professional life had snapped. That's when the floodgates opened. Not in a torrent of tears or a roar of anger, but in a slow, relentless tide of memories. Flashbacks. I leaned against the workbench, the cold metal, a stark contrast to the heat rising in my face, and let them come. I remembered Richard Sterling, the CFO, calling me in a blind panic 15 years ago. It was a Sunday. He had been working on the annual budget, a labyrinthine Excel spreadsheet with thousands of interconnected cells, and had somehow managed to delete the master file and then empty his recycle bin. He was hyperventilating on the phone, talking about ruin, about the board meeting the next day. I drove to the office, spent 7 straight hours in the server room, and using a piece of data recovery software that was probably older than he was, I managed to pull the ghost of that file off the server's hard drive. I rebuilt it, cell by agonizing cell. I handed it to him at 4 a.m. His hands were shaking. He looked at me like I was a wizard. He said, "Howard, I owe you anything. You name it." The next day, at the all-hands meeting, he took full credit for working through the night to finalize the numbers. He never mentioned my name. I let it go. It was part of the job. Competence is often silent. I remembered the quiet war between sales and engineering. Sales would promise clients custom features that didn't exist, signing contracts based on fantasy. Then they'd throw the mess over the wall to engineering, who would come to my team, furious, demanding to know how they were supposed to integrate with a non-existent API. My team and I would be stuck in the middle, building frantic, last-minute workarounds and custom patches to hold the fragile piece together, to make the impossible promises of the sales team a reality. We were the unsung diplomats, the secret engineers, the ones who turned vaporware into functional code. Gregory Finch's predecessor, a decent man named Frank, understood this. He knew our value, but Frank was pushed out. He was too old school, they said. He didn't leverage synergies. He was replaced by Gregory, a man who saw our department not as a strategic asset, but as a cost center, a bloated, expensive line on his spreadsheet that needed to be trimmed. The memory that cut the deepest, though, was about my team. I thought about David. I'd hired him when he was just a kid, full of raw talent but no direction. I saw something in him, a hunger to understand how things worked. I mentored him, trained him, gave him responsibility. I watched him grow into one of the most brilliant network engineers I'd ever known. He bought his first house last year. His wife just had a baby. And now, because of a decision made by a man who couldn't tell a router from a coffee maker, his future was uncertain. I thought about Maria, our cybersecurity expert. She had escaped a bad marriage and was raising 2 kids on her own. She was fiercely intelligent, the guardian of our digital walls. She was the one who detected and neutralized a sophisticated ransomware attack last year that would have crippled the company. She did it silently, over a 72-hour period with no sleep, while the executives were blissfully unaware, patting themselves on the back for another profitable quarter. Her reward, a pink slip. Sitting there in the cold, dusty air of my workshop, the full weight of the betrayal settled on me. It wasn't just about the money or the pension I was just 2 years away from. It was about the erasure of a lifetime of work. It was the condescending assumption that what we did was simple, that it could be easily replicated by a faceless team on the other side of the world for a fraction of the price. They didn't see the intricate web of relationships, the years of accumulated knowledge, the deep understanding of the company's hidden flaws and fragile workarounds that kept the whole thing from collapsing. They didn't see the art in it, they only saw the cost. And that's when the resolve began to form. It wasn't a hot, fiery anger. It was cold. It was the cold, hard logic of a system builder. They wanted a smooth transition. Fine, I would give them one. But a system is more than just its documented parts. It has a soul. It has a history, and I was the only one who knew all its secrets. My phone buzzed on the workbench, startling me out of my reverie. It was a text from David. It read, "Howard, they're here. The Synthocorp people. They're asking for the root passwords. What do I do?" I stared at the message, the glowing letters a beacon in the dim light, and then another call came in. The caller ID said Kepler Aerospace. My heart skipped a beat. Kepler was our whale, our biggest, most important client. I answered, "Howard, it's Marcus Thorne." His voice was deep, concerned. "I just heard a rumor you might be leaving Aerospec. Tell me it isn't true." The catalyst. It's funny how a single moment can change everything. The fog of despair began to lift, replaced by the crystal clear clarity of a new design. I took a deep breath. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady, "it's true, but don't you worry. We need to talk." In that moment, the old loyal Howard died, and in his place, a new Howard was born, not a saboteur, a strategist, and his first move was already on the board. A plan began to form, not in a single flash of inspiration, but like one of my clockwork mechanisms, with each piece clicking logically into the next. The foundation of this plan wasn't malice, it was foresight. For years I had operated on a simple principle: hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. In a corporate environment, the worst usually meant a catastrophic server failure or a massive data breach. I never imagined it would be the systematic dismantling of my own department, but the preparations I had made for technical disasters were, it turned out, perfectly suited for a strategic one. The centerpiece of my leverage was a system I had christened Artemis. To the executives at Aerospec, Artemis was just the name of our internal logistics and inventory management software. They saw it as a tool, a piece of company property. They had no concept of what it truly was. I had started building it over a decade ago. The off-the-shelf software the company was using at the time was clunky, inefficient, and couldn't handle the unique demands of our clients, especially in the aerospace sector where precision and documentation are everything. So I started writing my own modules in my own time. A little patch here, a custom script there, a way to automate the tedious compliance paperwork for Kepler Aerospace, a new interface for the warehouse team that was so intuitive, training took an hour instead of a week. Over the years it grew. It evolved. It became the central nervous system of Aerospec. Artemis wasn't just software. It was a living, breathing chronicle of the company's real-world operations. It had undocumented features that I'd built as favors for different departments, secret handshakes between systems that made the official clunky workflow bearable. The sales team's commission reports were automatically generated by a script I wrote that pulled data directly from the shipping department's database, bypassing 3 layers of bureaucratic approval. The CFO's quarterly projections relied on a data parsing tool I'd embedded that cleaned up the messy, error-filled input from the regional offices. These weren't rogue features, they were lifelines. They were the unofficial, undocumented, and utterly essential workarounds that kept the company functioning. And the documentation for them, it existed in only one place: my head. The smooth transition would involve me providing the SynthoCorp team with the official surface-level documentation. I would give them the blueprints for the house, but not the information about the custom-built support beams I had installed in the basement, without which the whole structure was unsound. My second piece of leverage was my knowledge of the company's dirty little secrets. The most significant of these belonged to Richard Sterling, the CFO I had saved all those years ago. About a year back, we needed a major server infrastructure upgrade. I had spec'd out a top-of-the-line system from Dell, robust, redundant, with plenty of room for growth. The price tag was hefty, but necessary. Richard had balked. It was the end of the fiscal quarter, and he was desperate to make his numbers look good for the board. He had personally intervened, overruled my recommendation, and approved the purchase of cheaper, underspec'd servers from a less reputable vendor. He had saved the company nearly $250,000 on paper, a move for which he was lauded as a fiscal genius. He'd made me sign off on the change order, burying my written objections in a flurry of emails. I kept a copy of that email chain, of course. I kept a copy of everything. Those servers were now the backbone of our primary data center. They were a ticking time bomb. They ran hot, they had intermittent power supply issues, and their processing capacity was already redlining at peak hours. I knew, with the certainty of a man who has seen it 100 times, that they could not handle the stress of a full-scale data migration. They would fail. It wasn't a matter of if, but when, and I was going to schedule that when with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. But the most powerful asset I had wasn't technical, it was human, it was my network. First there was David, my mole. After I got off the phone with him that first night, I called him back. I told him what was happening, and I told him to stay calm and play along. He was my eyes and ears inside the walls. He would feed me information on the SynthoCorp team's progress, their struggles, their inevitable panic. He was loyal to me, not to the company that had just tossed him on the scrap heap. Second, there was my sister-in-law, Jessica. She was a partner at a boutique law firm specializing in corporate litigation. That weekend, I sat in her plush office, the smell of leather-bound books and ambition in the air, and laid out the whole situation. I showed her the severance agreement, the non-compete clause. She read it, a small predatory smile playing on her lips. She explained that these overly broad non-competes were often legally questionable, especially when an employee is terminated without cause. They were scare tactics. She said, "Howard, they can't stop you from making a living. You just can't directly poach their clients or use their proprietary trade secrets." I looked at her and said, "What if the clients come to me? And what if the trade secret is a system so complex and undocumented that only I can run it effectively?" She leaned back in her chair. "Now that," she said, "is a very interesting gray area. Let them try to sue. It will be a very, very expensive lesson for them in the difference between owning a car and knowing how to drive it." She agreed to represent me pro bono, fueled by a righteous anger at corporate bullying, and I suspect the sheer intellectual challenge of it all. Finally, and most importantly, there was Marcus Thorne. The call with him had been a revelation. He was the CEO of Kepler Aerospace, our billion-dollar client. His loyalty, it turned out, wasn't to Aerospec Logistics. It was to me. For 15 years I had been his go-to guy. When a shipment of sensitive satellite components needed to be rerouted from a hurricane zone, he didn't call the Aerospec sales rep. He called my direct line. When he needed to set up a secure encrypted data link between his labs and our warehouse, I was the one who personally designed and implemented it. I understood his business, his needs, his obsession with perfection. I was more than a vendor, I was a partner. During our call I was careful. I didn't badmouth Aerospec. I simply stated the facts. My position was being eliminated, and I was planning to start my own specialized logistics consultancy. I told him, "Marcus, my first priority in these next 30 days is to ensure your operations continue without a single hitch. I will personally oversee the transition of your account." What I didn't say was that I knew the transition would be a disaster in anyone else's hands. The integration between Artemis and Kepler's own proprietary inventory system was a masterpiece of custom coding, a delicate dance of data that I had orchestrated. It was so tailored, so specific, that the documentation looked like gibberish to anyone who hadn't built it. Marcus, a brilliant engineer in his own right, understood the subtext immediately. He said, "Howard, you let me know where you land. A man with your skills is a valuable asset. We value our assets." It wasn't a promise, it was a statement of fact. The plan was set. I had the means, the intricate, booby-trapped system of Artemis. I had the motive, 28 years of loyalty thrown back in my face. And I had the opportunity, 30 days, to orchestrate a perfectly deniable, perfectly predictable system-wide collapse, all under the guise of being a team player. The server room doesn't care about your MBA, Gregory. It cares about competence. And you've just fired the one man who had it. The first week of the smooth transition was a masterclass in malicious compliance. I was the picture of helpfulness. I met with the Synthacorp transition team, a group of fresh-faced kids led by a manager named Raj who spoke in a rapid-fire stream of technical jargon that sounded impressive, but signified nothing. They were smart. I'll give them that. Book smart. They understood networks, databases, and security protocols in the abstract, theoretical sense. But they had no feel for the machine. They didn't understand the history, the scars, the quirks of a system that had been patched, upgraded, and jerry-rigged for over a decade. They were like pilots who had only ever used a flight simulator, and I was about to hand them the keys to a vintage, temperamental, high-performance aircraft. My days were filled with meetings. I walked them through the network architecture diagrams, the official ones, of course, which were about as representative of reality as a fast food burger is of its picture on the menu. I gave them access to the source code repository for Artemis, a sprawling, labyrinthine library of code with comments that were technically accurate but strategically vague. I scheduled hours of training sessions. I'd sit in a conference room with them, a projector screen glowing with process flow charts, and explain in excruciating detail the standard operating procedure for, say, generating a shipping manifest. I would explain every single step of the official process, the one nobody actually used because it took 4 times as long as the simple script I had written for the warehouse manager years ago. They would dutifully take notes, their faces a mixture of concentration and boredom, never once asking the most important question, does anyone actually do it this way? They were focused on the what's, never the why. Competence isn't cheap until you lose it, and they were losing it, one useless training session at a time. My first real move was subtle. It was an act of omission, not commission. The Synthocorp team needed to set up a staging environment to test the migration process. This meant creating a perfect clone of our live server environment. I provided them with the full system specs, the software manifests, everything they asked for, everything that is except the detailed configuration files for the custom firmware on our network switches and load balancers. These were tiny, seemingly insignificant text files that governed how data traffic was prioritized and routed. I had tweaked them over the years to give preference to the constant stream of data from Kepler Aerospace's systems, ensuring that their connection was always rock solid, even during peak loads. Without those specific configurations, the network would still function, but it would be sluggish, unreliable, prone to random packet loss. To an outsider, it would look like a hardware problem, a faulty cable, or a server running slow. It would be a ghost in the machine, impossible to diagnose without knowing exactly where to look. I handed over the default firmware settings. It was like giving someone a recipe for a cake but leaving out the baking powder. The cake will look fine, but it will never rise. The first sign of panic came on a Thursday afternoon. I was in my office, methodically deleting personal files and archiving old project documents, when I got a text from David. Raj is freaking out. The staging server keeps dropping the connection to the test client. He's blaming the network card. I smiled. It was beginning. I walked over to the transition team's designated war room. The air was thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee. Raj was on his hands and knees behind the server rack, a flashlight in his mouth, jiggling a network cable. It must be a physical layer issue, he muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. The diagnostics are all green, but we're getting 30% packet loss. I leaned against the door frame, projecting an air of paternal concern. That's odd, I said. Those are brand new switches. Did you check the duplex settings? It was a classic misdirection, the IT equivalent of asking a mechanic if he checked the tire pressure when the engine won't start. It was a plausible yet completely irrelevant suggestion. It sent them down a rabbit hole for the rest of the day, checking every cable, every port, every network card, while the real problem remained invisible, hidden in plain sight within a configuration file they didn't even know existed. My next move was targeted directly at the C-suite. Gregory Finch, in his infinite wisdom, had decided that all executive password resets would now be handled by the Synthocorp help desk to streamline the process. I knew from years of painful experience that Richard Sterling, the CFO, was constitutionally incapable of remembering his password for more than a week at a time. He also had the technical aptitude of a garden gnome. I had set up a special simplified password reset portal just for him years ago, a little backdoor of convenience that bypassed the standard multi-factor authentication. On my second to last Friday, I decommissioned that portal. I simply deleted it. I documented it in my transition notes as sunsetting a redundant, non-standard legacy feature to enhance security. It was a perfectly defensible action, a best practice even. The predictable result came the following Monday. David texted me, "Sterling is on the warpath. He locked himself out of his email and the Synthocorp guy is asking him about his authentication token. He's screaming that he doesn't have a token." I could picture it perfectly. Sterling, his face turning a blotchy red, yelling into his phone at a confused help desk technician in Bangalore, who was calmly asking him to follow a protocol he couldn't possibly comprehend. The silent gears of convenience that I had maintained for years were slowly grinding to a halt. But the master stroke was the migration schedule, the big one. The final transfer of all data and operations from our servers to the new Synthocorp managed cloud environment. Gregory wanted it done as quickly as possible. I proposed a date for the final cutover the last Thursday of the month. I presented it in a meeting with a detailed project plan, highlighting how this date would minimize operational downtime by leading into the weekend. Gregory, eager to declare victory, signed off on it immediately. What he didn't know, or had never bothered to learn, was that the last Thursday of the quarter was the single most critical day for the finance department. It was the day Richard Sterling had to finalize and submit his quarterly earnings report to the board and the SEC. It was a day of frantic, high-stakes activity, where the entire finance team lived inside the Artemis system, pulling data, running reports, and making last-minute adjustments. Subjecting the system to a full-scale migration on that specific day was like performing open-heart surgery on a marathon runner in the middle of a race. It was a recipe for absolute, unmitigated chaos. I had just handed Gregory Finch the gun, helped him aim it at his own foot, and he had eagerly pulled the trigger, thanking me for my efficiency. The silent takeover was in motion. The dominoes were set, and all I had to do was wait for the first one to fall. The first tremor of the earthquake I had engineered arrived in the form of an email. It was from David, sent to my personal address late on the Tuesday of my final week. The subject line was a single word: Exodus. He told me that Maria, our cybersecurity rock, had just given her 2 weeks' notice. She had an offer from a bank downtown for a senior security position, a significant pay raise, and a corner office. She hadn't even been looking. A recruiter had found her. News of the Synthocorp takeover was spreading through the local tech community like a virus, and our best people were being headhunted. The sharks were circling, drawn by the blood in the water. Gregory Finch's cost-cutting measure was turning into a fire sale of his most valuable talent. The next day, 2 of our junior network techs, a pair of bright kids I'd personally mentored, walked into Gregory's office and quit. They were going with Maria. David's email ended with a sentence that was both a plea and a promise. I'm holding on, Howard. But this ship is sinking fast. The talent exodus had begun. It wasn't just about my team anymore. The culture of stability and expertise that had taken decades to build was being dismantled in a matter of weeks. The company was hollowing itself out from the inside. The first panicked call from management came on Wednesday morning, the day before the scheduled migration. It was Gregory Finch. His voice, usually so smooth and confident, had a raw, frayed edge to it. Howard, he said, skipping the pleasantries, I've got a problem. Richard Sterling can't get his preliminary reports to run. He says the system is timing out. Your man David says he can't figure it out. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, savoring it. That's strange, Gregory, I said, my voice a calm, placid lake. The system was running perfectly when I left yesterday. I documented all the performance metrics for the transition team. Did they make any changes to the server configurations? I knew they hadn't. They couldn't. They were still trying to figure out the packet loss issue in the staging environment. I was forcing him to confront the simple, terrifying truth. The system he had paid a fortune for was being run by people who didn't understand it. And the one person who did was walking out the door in less than 48 hours. No changes, he snapped, his frustration boiling over. Look, can you just take a look? For old time's sake, Richard is having a meltdown. This was the moment. The first test of my new reality. The old Howard would have caved. The old Howard would have felt a pang of responsibility, a pull of loyalty, and driven to the office to fix their mess one last time. But the old Howard was gone. Gregory, I said, my tone still perfectly even. My access was revoked yesterday afternoon, as per standard termination procedure. I'm no longer an employee. I'm afraid I can't help you. I'm sure the Synthocorp team with their advanced capabilities will get to the bottom of it. I have full confidence in the transition plan you approved. I could almost hear his teeth grinding over the phone. I had used his own corporate jargon, his own hollow reassurances as a shield. He was trapped in the very system of streamlined efficiency he had created. He sputtered for a moment, then said, "This is unacceptable, Howard. You have a responsibility." I cut him off. My responsibility, Gregory, was to ensure a smooth transition. I have provided over 200 pages of documentation and 40 hours of direct training. My work is done. If you'd like to hire me as an independent consultant, my rate is $500 an hour with a 4-hour minimum payable in advance. The silence on the other end of the line was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. He hung up without another word. The power had shifted. It was no longer a theoretical advantage. It was a tangible operational reality. They were blind and I was the only one who could give them back their sight, but now it came at a price. An hour later my phone rang again. It was Richard Sterling. He wasn't yelling. He was pleading. His voice was thin, reedy, stripped of its usual bluster. "Howard, please. You have to help me. The board meeting is tomorrow morning. The numbers, they keep changing. The reports are pulling corrupted data. It's a disaster." I felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a kind of grim satisfaction. This was the man who had taken credit for my work, who had risked the company's stability to pad his own bonus. "Richard," I said. The same calm, measured tone. "I'm sorry to hear you're having trouble. You know, this reminds me of the server upgrade last year. I seem to recall sending you an email warning that the servers you selected might have trouble handling heavy data loads. I believe I used the phrase prone to data corruption under stress. Does that sound familiar?" There was a choked sound on the other end of the line. He knew I had him. He knew I had the receipts. His desperate, short-sighted decision from a year ago had finally come home to roost, and I was there to deliver the bill. "What do you want, Howard?" he whispered. "Whatever my consulting fee is," I replied. "I assure you it's a bargain compared to what explaining this to the SEC will cost you." The talent had left. The systems were failing, and now the leadership was begging. The beautiful, elegant, and perfectly deniable collapse was entering its final phase. The morning of the final migration was a beautiful, clear Thursday. I spent it in my workshop, not with the grandfather clock, but with a new project. I was building a custom server rack for my new consultancy, my own. The smell of solder and fresh anti-static paint filled the air. It was the smell of a new beginning. My phone, sitting on the workbench, was my tether to the chaos I had unleashed. At 10 a.m., David texted, "They're starting the migration now. Good luck, boss." I didn't need luck. I had physics. I had logic. I had Richard Sterling's cheap servers and Raj's hubris. The migration was scheduled to take 6 hours. For the first 2 hours, silence. Then at 12:15 p.m., the first sign of the apocalypse. A text from David. "It's bad. The database transfer keeps failing. Corrupted tables. The Synthecorp guys are blaming our old hardware." Of course they were. It was the only logical conclusion for people who didn't know the hardware was deliberately under-specced. They were following the map I had drawn for them, and it was leading them right off the edge of the world. The real fireworks started an hour later. My phone rang. It was Marcus Thorne. "Howard," he said, and his voice was cold steel. "What in God's name is happening at Aerospec? My production line just went red. All of it. My inventory system is screaming that it's lost its connection with Artemis. I've got $100 million worth of satellite components sitting on a factory floor that can't be moved because we can't get shipping manifests. Every minute this continues costs me a fortune. I'm calling Gregory Finch and he's not answering." This was the kill shot. The undocumented, deeply integrated handshake between Artemis and Kepler Aerospace's systems was my ace in the hole. When the migration started, the delicate data stream had been severed. To Kepler's automated systems, it was the equivalent of their supply chain partner's heart stopping. Production was automatically halted to prevent catastrophic errors. "I'm sorry to hear that, Marcus," I said, my voice filled with a calm empathy I did not feel. "I'm officially no longer with them, but I believe they are in the middle of a major systems overhaul today." "Overhaul?" he barked. It's a meltdown. Howard, I'm not loyal to a logo. I'm loyal to competence. My contract is with the people who keep my production line moving. You get your new company's paperwork to my legal department by the end of the day. We're moving our business. All of it. He hung up. Checkmate. The final confrontation came 20 minutes later. The call I had been waiting for. It was Gregory Finch. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't pleading. He was screaming. It was a raw primal sound, the shriek of a man watching his entire world burn down around him. You did this, he shrieked, his voice cracking. You sabotaged us. This is sabotage. I'm going to sue you into oblivion. You'll never work in this town again. I held the phone away from my ear, waiting for him to run out of air. When he finally paused, gasping, I spoke. My voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it cut through his rage like a scalpel. Gregory, I said, let's be very clear. I did not sabotage anything. I did exactly what you asked me to do. I executed a smooth transition based on the infrastructure you approved and the personnel you hired. Every action I took is documented and defensible. The system didn't fail because of sabotage. The system failed because you didn't understand it. You replaced a team of dedicated experts with a low-cost commodity, and you got exactly what you paid for. I paused, letting the words sink in. There's a saying we have in IT, Gregory. The server room doesn't care about your MBA. It's a shame you never learned that. I could hear his labored breathing, the sound of a man utterly and completely defeated. You once told me my loyalty was legendary. I continued, twisting the knife he had tried to stab me with. You were right. My loyalty was to the system, to making it work. You broke that loyalty. And now you're seeing what happens when the system is loyal to no one. Before he could respond, I ended the call. I placed my phone back on the workbench and picked up a screwdriver. It was time to get back to work. My work, the aftermath was, from my perspective, a quiet and orderly affair. I received a frantic, formal-sounding email from Aerospec's legal department threatening litigation for breach of fiduciary duty and tortious interference. I forwarded it to my sister-in-law, Jessica, who replied with a single laughing emoji and the message, "Let them. This will be fun." They never filed the suit. The discovery process would have unearthed Richard Sterling's emails about the cheap servers and the mountain of evidence that the collapse was due to sheer unadulterated incompetence, not sabotage. Their threats were hollow, the last gasps of a dying beast. 2 weeks later, David sent me a link to a press release. Gregory Finch had resigned to pursue other opportunities. Richard Sterling had taken an early retirement. The board had brought in a turnaround specialist. Kepler Aerospace's departure had blown a massive fatal hole in their quarterly earnings. The stock had plummeted. The company that had been my home for 28 years was now on life support, a casualty of its own arrogance. My new company, which I named Nexus Logistics, was born not in a fancy office building but in my basement workshop. Our first employees were David, Maria, and the 2 junior techs who had quit in solidarity. Our first client, of course, was Kepler Aerospace. The contract was massive, more than I had ever dreamed of. Marcus Thorne didn't even negotiate the price. He just said, "Send me the invoice. Just keep my line running." We spent the first month working out of my home, our war room, the living room, fueled by Sarah's endless pots of coffee and a shared sense of purpose. We weren't just building a company, we were building a refuge. A place where competence was the only currency that mattered. 6 months later, we moved into our own office space. It wasn't huge, but it was ours. Clean, bright, with big windows and good coffee. In the lobby, right where visitors would see it when they walked in, I placed the fully restored 1920s grandfather clock. Its polished brass pendulum swung back and forth in a steady, reassuring rhythm. Its deep, resonant chime marked the hours, a constant reminder that order could be restored, that broken things could be made whole again, and that in the end, time has a way of settling all accounts. My new reality was better than the old one. I was no longer the invisible gear in someone else's machine. I was the architect of my own. I was working with people I respected, for clients who valued my expertise. The stress was still there, but it was different. It was the good stress, the stress of building something, not the soul-crushing stress of trying to hold something broken together. I finally understood that my value wasn't tied to a company name or a job title. It was inside me. It was the knowledge I had built, the relationships I had nurtured, and the quiet, unwavering belief that a job done right is a reward in itself. The executives at Aerospec had tried to take everything from me. They had tried to erase my career, but in the end they only succeeded in setting me free. So here's the moral of the story, if you can call it that. In any organization, there are two types of value. There's the value you can see on a spreadsheet, the salaries, the overhead, the costs that can be cut. And then there's the real value, the institutional knowledge, the trust, the quiet competence of the people who know how the damn thing actually works. The people who keep the heart of the company beating. Arrogant leaders, the ones with the fancy degrees and the buzzword vocabularies, they only ever see the first kind of value. They look at a veteran employee and see a cost. They don't see the years of saved disasters, the patched up holes, the deep, intricate knowledge that can't be documented in a binder or transitioned to a low-cost provider. They think competence is a commodity, but they're wrong. Competence is an asset, and if you don't value your assets, you will lose them. It's not a threat, it's just a law of nature. The system always corrects itself. Sometimes it just needs a little push. For anyone out there who has ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or erased by a boss who wouldn't know a server from a sandwich, know this: your knowledge is your power, your relationships are your leverage. Don't ever let anyone convince you that what you do is simple or that you are easily replaced. They need you far more than you need them. They just don't know it yet, but they will. Eventually, everyone learns. Sometimes they just have to learn it the hard way. If this story resonated with you, do me a favor, like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time you saw an incompetent boss get what they deserved. And make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I have a lot more stories to tell. Thanks for listening.